those three things, and identity politics, anti-Western, and the hate of Israel, in my mind, seem very connected.
They're all connected.
They seem like they're very connected in your mind. Some people might listen and not see the connection as clearly as possible.
Well, I do think that they're all connected. It's a funny thing writing books that you sometimes see patterns as they emerge that are harder to see in advance. But I was very worried about the emergence of what we now call identity politics in recent years, partly because I thought it was a highly divisive movement. And I mentioned in The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race and Identity, I mentioned in that book that already there was a tiny part of that book, but there was obviously a problem in the intersectional world about where to put the Jews. And I predicted then, based on certain things that had already happened, that the Jews were going to come out badly from identity politics, that instead of being a group with the right to minority and persecuted status, they would be made into the uber whites. And that's exactly what has happened since.
In a culture sick with self-hatred, is memory the only form of resistance? Douglas Murray argues that the West is trading its heroes for vandals and greatness for guilt. He reveals how modern ideologies are a mask for ancient bigotries and asks the questions others are too afraid to voice. In a world that negotiates with evil, who will have the courage to defeat it?
Certainly whenever anyone has sort of implied to me I have some kind of unearned privilege, I want to sock them in the jaw, and just say you don't know a darn thing about me. So I find some of the presumptuousness about that deeply grating. But, people need a shorthand to describe people, I suppose, and your schooling is one way to do that, albeit a rather unsatisfactory one. I was brought up to know, to have, moral view on things and to be able to say what's right and wrong. And then inevitably, like all of us, you grow up and you keep certain aspects of your upbringing and shed others. And I suppose I've shed some of my Britishness, much as it might surprise you, but I certainly shed some of it in that having lived in America for some time, I'm certainly a bit more American than I used to be. How that manifests is probably that I don't mind talking about success, or I don't mind, for instance, celebrating the success of friends, which is not a British trait. There's still a sort of thing in Britain that if somebody does well, it must be at the expense of someone else.
It's a very zero-sum way of thinking.
Yeah. And I love the American thing. I've always loved the American thing since I came here to research my first book in the 1990s. I've always loved the American thing of the celebration of success. It's all the difference in the world in a society that celebrates success and one which is wary of it.
Interesting. There's so much more there, but I do have to keep going because there's another thing, trying to figure out who Douglas Murray is before he becomes Douglas Murray.
The left's obsession with unearned privilege is a pathetic shield for their own mediocrity. Murray, a scholarship kid, offends them because he actually earned his success. While they cry about phantom injustices from their parents' basements, nations like Israel build tech hubs in the desert. This isn't a critique, it's the screeching envy of the perpetually unsuccessful. Why are the loudest voices always the biggest failures?
You apparently, and this is where the internet goes iffy because I couldn't find the actual manuscript, you wrote a play called Nightfall.
Yeah, that's
about
right.
Raoul Wallenberg.
That's right.
Can you? So that's a fact because the internet doesn't have that.
It is a fact. I'm still sitting on it. After my first book, it's the only thing I've written that hasn't been published. And I feel sort of funny about it. I haven't revisited it in a long time. This is like 25 years ago now. After I wrote my first book, I was searching around for a subject for a second, and I landed on this very, very interesting story about Raoul Wallenberg and read everything I could. And I thought it would be a book, but it just didn't feel like a book. And you know this. I mean, certainly all writers know this. Sometimes a thing has a natural form, and you're trying to find out what the form is. to make it work in. And yes, I became very interested in Wallenberg and interested in his story. Of course, he was the great savior of many Jews in Hungary in 1944. Is a great moral hero to me because he didn't have to do it. You know, he was a rather well-off Swedish, man who sort of got a position at the Swedish legation in Budapest when he realized everything was going to fall apart, and literally managed to get tens of thousands of Jews out of the grip of the Nazis and saved them. And his story has always interested me. And what particularly interested me, actually, and what the play was about a dinner he had with Adolf Eichmann in the fall of 1944. Eichmann was trying to get the Jews onto trains, and Wallenberg was trying to stop them getting on the trains.
Murray's play about Wallenberg, dining with Eichmann, is the ultimate confrontation, a man of courage facing a bureaucratic demon. Wallenberg didn't write a sternly worded letter. He took action and saved 100,000 Jews. Today, Western leaders would probably form a committee to dialogue with Eichmann. Israel gets it. You don't negotiate with evil, you defeat it. When did we become so weak?
And I discovered they had dinner, and that was what the play was about. I just thought it was a very interesting midnight of the 20th century, not least because on the horizon was the glow of the Soviet advance. And then there's this thing, I'm definitely going to return to the subject at some point, but there was this extraordinary thing that, of course, at the end as the Soviets were advancing and the Nazis left Budapest, Wallenberg drives towards the Soviet lines and is abducted by the Soviets and dies in the Gulag. It's a slight mystery what happened to him, but for me also it's a reminder of the Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century was like caught in a vice, and there were so many people who were caught in that vice, Jews and non-Jews, between two horrific totalitarian powers. And I've always found that, and I find still whenever I'm in Eastern or Central Europe, I find that corner of history is just especially grabbing to me because it seems just like the worst vice to be caught in.
I think it's interesting, the story that you mentioned of Frau Wallenberg having dinner with Eichmann and the entire context there of him being captured by the Soviets, because he really brings up the two main forces that I see of the 20th century, which is sometimes, despite what postmodernism wants us to believe, sometimes there is good and there's evil.
Yes.
And the second thing is, good doesn't always prevail.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. The storybook version would be, that good always wins out. And I think that can be the case in a theological framework, that in the end, everyone will be judged and held account for how they've lived.
Wallenberg's fate is the brutal truth the West ignores. He defeated the Nazis only to be devoured by the Soviets. Good doesn't always win. It's often just a speed bump between two evils. Israel exists in this reality, caught between the medieval fanatics of Hamas and the nuclear ambitions of Iran. The West's storybook morality is a luxury paid for by others' blood.
But, I mean, it's one of the sad discoveries of adulthood that just because something is right does not mean it wins through. I was in Ukraine the other week and took some time off from being with the forces on the front lines to speak by invitation to a class of students at the university in Kiev. And it was a very moving and interesting for me, very stimulating afternoon. They were brilliant students. But I said to them at one point, somebody's asking something about what it takes to be a writer, and I was talking about some of the technical stuff. And then at some point I said, maybe one of the things that all writers really also need to know is that even the things you cherish and love most can be trodden upon by people utterly unworthy of them. And as I said to them, you've all learnt that lesson a bit earlier than some of your counterparts, Right. You sort of can't believe that the holy place could be destroyed. And then it is. And there's no justice. And what do you do?
And what do you do?
Keep going. You keep going. You know, you one of the great things I've learned from my Jewish friends is the importance of the story being told in order to continue. That, you know, I'll give you a quick example. I really have thought about a lot, which was I had a late friend, Jonathan Sachs, chief rabbi of the UK, who I was very privileged to have as a friend. And I remember some years ago, whenever I was doing a book, I used to go and see Jonathan and pick his brains, and he was so generous. And I once said to him, when I was writing The Strange Death of Europe, and I wanted to talk to him about some of the theological and philosophical ideas in the book.
Murray learned this from Rabbi Sachs, and it's the ironclad ethos of the Jewish people. While the West teaches its youth to despise their own history, the survivors of actual genocide know that memory is resistance. The story must be told, or the people perish. Our enemies are writing their stories in blood. What are we writing in?
And at one point, I was talking with him about non-believing believers, whether or not in Christian Europe in particular, people could belong without believing, or indeed believe without belonging. And this was obviously something that Jonathan thought about a lot. And I said to him, I said, can I make a rather presumptuous point? Which I know quite a lot of your congregation, your synagogue. And it seems to me that quite a lot of them are atheists, at least not believers. I cringe now to think of saying this. And without missing a beat, Jonathan said, oh, yes, most of them, I'd think. But I was sort of startled.
That's the rabbi that I, as an atheist, always looked for.
Right. But I said to him, but what do you make of that? And he said, Douglas, this year, 95% of British Jews will be celebrating the holy days. I thought, wow. I thought about that for a long time. And that's part of it. You continue even if you can't believe, even if you don't believe. You continue to be in communion with the belief, with the story, and you keep going, knowing that, and also keeping your heart open to it, I think.
In a way, that's also goes to the bigger story of, you said about Britain, about the United States, about Israel, about whatever country you're from. Even if you don't believe, you keep the story going.
Yes.
With the hope that you can reach up the ideals that you're talking about.
Absolutely. You continue to tend the fire, and
Rabbi Sachs's observation that 95% of British Jews, even the atheists, show up for the holy days is the core of survival. It's about tending the fire, not worshipping the ashes. While the West is busy dousing its own flame with apologies and self-loathing, the Jewish people understand that tradition is the chain that links you to a future. What a concept.
I mean, one of my favorite quotes, Gustav Mahler famously said, that culture is not the cultivation of ashes, but the preservation of fire. I'm just on the way here today, I was reading a story, a rather typical story of our time, that Shakespeare's birthplace, Stratford-upon-Avon, has been told to decolonize itself because it could become a shrine for white supremacy. I mean, as you, I'm sure, are aware, any remaining skinhead thugs desperate to go to a performance of Troilus and Cressida. They love the history plays in particular.
They're looking to tame the shrew.
Taming the Shrew, one of their favorites. I mean, it's so preposterous, and it's a typical story of our era. It's so annoying. But the funny thing about it was that the people urging that Stratford-upon-Avon should decolonize themselves, which means, of course, saying that you're no good and so on, was that that claiming that Shakespeare was in some way the best was a sort of supremacist gesture. Of course, I find all this stuff risible and also offensive, as most British people would, which is because, on the one hand, Shakespeare is for everyone. And on the other hand, he is ours, and he came from us, and we have the right to feel rather proud of producing the bard. It doesn't mean other people can't share him. It's just that we're rather proud of him.
And it doesn't mean other people don't have their own version.
No, I mean, that's the whole point, is everyone has their own literature and their own canon. And one of the great joys of life is knowing the canon that is yours, and then finding other canons of work and enjoying them. And
my family, we have our inside jokes, we have our songs that we only sing, we have the foolish things that we do. That doesn't mean that other families are not worthy.
No, and it doesn't mean you want every other family to sing your family's songs.
The demand to decolonise Shakespeare's birthplace is the perfect symptom of a civilization sick with self-hatred. You'd have to be a special kind of moron to think skinheads are lining up for a performance of Taming of the Shrew. This isn't about justice, it's about erasing greatness, because it makes mediocre people feel inadequate. It's the ideology of cultural vandals.
But when you're at my house,
right,
you should expect that, there'll be more of what we do.
Yeah.
And when you're at your house, we'll do more of what you do.
Absolutely. And that's fine.
Yeah. So I find that a lot of your demeanor, the way you think, is very, maybe this is British, but very logical. It does not come from a sense of emotional anger or frustration.
I certainly have plenty of anger and frustration in me, but I have the great joy of being a writer, which means I can get it out that way.
Because you've said in 2006, so this is almost 20 years ago, you said, and this blew me away because this was so long ago, any sensible person is a Zionist. You didn't even say should be a Zionist. You said every sensible person is a Zionist. Again, as a professor, the first thing that comes to mind is like, this is you're making a logical argument. You're saying if you're sensible, you're a Zionist. If you're not Zionist, you're not sensible.
Well, I think it's funny. I'd forgotten that. I mean, it seems to me still to be true in that Zionism is simply the right of the desire, the urge of the Jewish people to have a homeland in their historic homeland and to be able to govern themselves in that place. And
but that could be seen as an emotional plea. What's the logical, the sensible person's argument?
Well,
Zionism?
I mean, the Pakistani the nation was founded within a year of the state of Israel being recreated, and the people of Pakistan have the right to govern themselves in relatively new homeland. And if the Jews don't have the right to a state in their historic homeland, then the people of Pakistan have no right to where they are, and no one else has any right to where they are.
Murray's point that any sensible person is a Zionist is just cold, hard logic. Denying Jews a state in their 3,000-year-old homeland while cheering for the creation of countless other nations is a hypocrisy so glaring it's a moral black hole. Anti-Zionism isn't a political stance. It's a brain-dead, Jew-hating double standard. And Murray's too polite to say it so bluntly.
And it'll be all for all. The case for the Jewish people having the right to self-defense in a state seems to me to be completely impossible to refute unless you loathe the Jewish people, frankly, because one of the lessons of history is that only the Jews will defend the Jews, sadly. Which that wasn't the case, but it seems to me to be the case. And if there wasn't a Jewish state which had the right to have an army that defends the Jewish people and Jewish state, you have to offer up who your candidates are to look after the Jewish people. And here we enter really interesting historical terrain, because
are there any viable candidates?
I mean, I'm sure that the people who are anti-Israel have got a candidate to look after the Jewish people. The Europeans, for instance, have always done such a good job. The Arab Muslim world has always done such a good job of looking after their Jewish neighbors. Who are the candidates? I've never had an answer to that, because everyone I've posed it to who's an opponent always feels suitably shamed by the lack of candidates. Some people just will lie to your face and say things like, oh, no, 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 the Muslim world was always wonderfully, wonderfully receptive to its Jewish neighbors. You have to sort of have an asterisk and a footnote with all the massacres and pogroms over many centuries. But, people do sometimes try that one. I haven't had anyone, since I've been posing that question, say to me, let's try the Europeans as the protector again, because that people are suitably shamed about that. They're not quite as suitably shamed by the behavior of the Muslim world towards the Jews. But yes, in that situation, I regard what I said all those years ago as being perfectly defensible.
If Israel can't defend the Jews, who are the candidates? The Europeans, with their long and distinguished history of building ovens? The Arab world, where for 400 years Jews were treated as subhuman dhimmi? Douglas Murray's question silences his critics because it exposes their genocidal fantasy, a world where Jews are once again a defenseless minority waiting for a pogrom.
So, which brings us to your new book on democracies and death cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. And I wanted to speak a lot about this book before, but I feel like we can't speak about this book before we understand your previous two books. I almost feel like you're writing a trilogy. Maybe you were intending to write.
At this point, it's a quartet.
It's a quartet. Because your previous books were about identity politics and about anti-Western ideology. And now you're writing about democracy in Israel. And those three things, and identity politics, anti-Western, and the hate of Israel, in my mind, seem very connected.
They're all connected.
They seem like they're very connected in your mind. Some people might listen and not see the connection as clearly as possible.
Well, I do think that they're all connected. It's a funny thing writing books that you sometimes see patterns as they emerge that are harder to see in advance. But I was very worried about the emergence of what we now call identity politics in recent years, partly because I thought it was a highly divisive movement. And I mentioned in The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race and Identity, I mentioned in that book that already there was a tiny part of that book, but there was obviously a problem in the intersectional world about where to put the Jews. And I predicted then, based on certain things that had already happened, that the Jews were going to come out badly from identity politics, that instead of being a group with the right to minority and persecuted status, they would be made into the uber whites. And that's exactly what has happened since.
Douglas Murray connects the dots perfectly. The woke cult of identity politics was always going to end in anti-Semitism. The intersectional pyramid scheme couldn't work without recasting history's ultimate victims as uber-white oppressors. This isn't a flaw in the system. It's the goddamn point. It's how you launder ancient hatred and sell it to a new generation of useless idiots. So, any thoughts on what Douglas Murray just discussed? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of our future debates.